When Heather finds the immunity statue in All Stars originally, she decides to keep it in its hiding place, allowing Alejandro to come and steal it, eliminating her in this episode. But this what if is just going to be talking about what if Heather pocketed the immunity statue instead of letting it go in her spot. I don't want to waste too much more time, so let's just get right into it. When Heather finds her immunity statue, she finds it in front of Alejandro without her knowing. And I considered if he could use this against her, like confront her instantly about it and, blackmail her. But at this point, Heather has already gone around to everybody on the villains team, telling them they should vote out Alejandro. And even in the original, she tells Alejandro almost instantly that she found it, so she clearly isn't that worried about keeping it a secret, at least with Alejandro. However, Alejandro's a smart guy, and in the original, he used the immunity statue and voted for Heather, so he clearly knew votes were coming his way. I don't imagine he would just sit back and let that happen now without the immunity statue. So after the challenge in which the villains lose still, Alejandro would start finding time to talk to the villains to convince them to vote off Heather instead. Because he knows that Heather has the statue, so we would like it if Heather's statue could instantly be used, so that way she can't have it during the merge or something like that, because then it becomes a lot more dangerous. So he'd want to get rid of it now. And if he could get everyone to vote for Heather, then Heather would throw her vote onto Alejandro, and Alejandro would throw his vote on someone like Cameron. So that way it becomes a 1-1 tie between him and Alejandro, and they have to face off in a tiebreaker, which Alejandro would obviously think he could win. The harder question is if he could actually pull this off. When looking at the votes, Courtney controls 3 of the votes of this elimination. She has her own vote, she has Scott's vote because Scott really likes her and listens to her, and Gwen makes a deal with Courtney at this elimination ceremony that she'll vote whatever way Courtney tells her to repair their relationship. This means that if Alejandro could convince Courtney to vote for Heather, then his plan would work since they were all voting for Heather. They could also easily bring in Cameron with someone like Gwen, who is being pretty good friends with him this episode, telling him that he can vote for Heather and it'll be okay and he'll be safe. And also Cameron would be pretty willing to follow along with that vote since he saw her last season and her seasons before, and he knows that Heather's a very untrustworthy person and already dislikes her. And I don't think normally Alejandro could convince Courtney, since she was shown this season to not really like Alejandro too much, and also only really liked him romantically, but now she's falling for Scott instead, so Alejandro wouldn't even be able to use his charm on her. But because Alejandro has the knowledge that Heather has the immunity statue, he would confide this with Courtney, and Courtney also really doesn't like Heather, and she wouldn't want Heather to have a statue moving forward. So she would agree with the plan, also because Alejandro could potentially lie to her and say he'll vote for Gwen so they can have a tiebreaker and he'll get rid of Gwen, which then Courtney would absolutely go with. So in my opinion, even if that first attempt doesn't work, him saying he's going to get rid of Gwen would instantly be a green for Courtney to go with the plan. This allows for Alejandro's plan to fall fully into motion, with Courtney convincing Scott and then Gwen being able to tell Cameron to vote for Heather. This gives these 4 votes onto Heather, Heather voting for Alejandro, and then Alejandro voting for Cameron. And then Heather would obviously have to play her immunity statue so she doesn't get eliminated. So this would cause a tiebreaker between Alejandro and Cameron. Cameron would be scared, but he could still be slightly confident about this tiebreaker, because Alejandro is still walking on his hands at this point in the season, so he thinks he has a chance. But in a much more meaningful reveal than the original, Alejandro flips over onto his legs, revealing they still work, shocking the entire team and infuriating Heather because she was right all along. I don't know exactly what the tiebreaker would be, but Alejandro would clearly win. The only type of challenge Cameron could beat Alejandro in is something educational, but even then Alejandro was shown in World Tour to actually be pretty smart, so even then it would be a toss-up. It was shown in World Tour that the tiebreakers are based off something that happens in the challenge, and today's challenge is about collecting eggs from mutant monsters, so clearly there's no academic aspect to any of that. So Alejandro beats Cameron, sending Cameron home as he says goodbye to the Heroes team and apologizing to Mike that he won't be able to help him with his problem. And Mike would still volunteer for Boney Island since there isn't reason for him not to, which would also cause him to whistle and cause Duncan to know about him being Mal. Sierra would still be on the path of being a mother instead of dating Cam Cody, but it would be even more reinforced this time since he isn't even here anymore, so she would go full in on being a mother to our weird little pet rats. Heather would be furious at Alejandro and confront him aggressively, which Alejandro dismisses and instead warns her that she's in a lot of trouble and she should watch what she says. Duncan would still warn Zoe about Mal while Mike is on Boney Island. And in the original, Zoe got a reward for getting the most eggs in the last challenge, which allows Zoe to not have to box, and instantly gives the heroes a point. Everything plays the same out with the Scott and Fang fight. Scott would get absolutely destroyed, getting no points, and then while Courtney helps him out, Gwen would help, repairing their friendship. And Sierra would still face the mom of her little pet Sing and get destroyed too, since there's no reason that should change. So the score remains 1 point for heroes, 0 points for villains. Alejandro would face his older brother Jose and still beat him out of anger for him calling Heather unattractive. Heather would blush at Alejandro's compliment, but once he mentions the blush on her face, she gets more annoyed with him. This makes the score 1-1. Cameron originally calls out the wheel for being rigged, giving all the contestants personal opponents, but since he isn't here anymore, the wheel would continue being rigged, meaning Mal has to face all the blind gophers. And even though Mal is in control and shown to be a ruthless fighter, it is guaranteed impossible that he somehow beats all the gophers because there was like 7 of them, so he would lose. And Chris would force Heather to go next for the villains, since he would want to save Courtney and Gwen fight till the end. I'm assuming that since Chris said this challenge takes inspiration from the Phobia Factor challenge in Island, that Heather would fight a sumo wrestler, which was her fear. Not that this really matters if she wins or loses, because Gwen and Courtney's fight will already happen and give the villains the win. And as a nice callback to season 1, I decide that Heather would beat the sumo wrestler the same way she did, by ducking and unintentionally making the sumo wrestler trip, making the score 2-1. For the hero's side, Duncan's the only one left to fight, since Zoe was given a pass to not have to fight. And everything goes the same. He'd face the bird, not want to fight the bird, and yeah. And everything with the Courtney and Gwen fight goes exactly the same. Gwen and Courtney forgive each other, and Chris gives them both a point for warming his cold heart, giving the villains the win, and making the heroic hamsters go to elimination ceremony. But this vote is actually special, because the villains get to decide who goes home on the heroes. Now Cameron isn't on the villains anymore, and I imagine he was the one heavily pitching for Sierra to go home because, you know, she was being creepy towards him. But since in the original, the villains decide within seconds that Sierra is going out, that seemed like that's already kind of the group consensus. And Heather wouldn't really be against voting out Sierra since she saw how crazy and powerful Sierra was in World Tour. So they'd still decide that Sierra's going home, and then the heroic hamsters would send Alejandro, not that it really matters. Gwen and Courtney act like best friends again in the winner's female sleeping area in the spa hotel, and even declare to each other that they want to go to the end together. But now that Heather is in there, she would overhear the conversation and worry about them working too closely together. That's about the only thing that would change, so we're just going to go straight to the challenge. While all the contestants are running to the boats, Heather would catch up with Alejandro, and worried about everyone else partnering off into groups. You know, these 3, these 2, even Duncan kind of working with them. She makes an offer to Alejandro for a temporary alliance. Alejandro rolls his eyes at the offer and asks why he would work with her after she just voted for him, and Heather would mention that he flushed her immunity statue and that they are even. Alejandro says fair enough and agrees to work with Heather, and since Alejandro got to the boats first, he would get to the same boat and Heather would join him. Courtney and Gwen would get to the same boat and share it again, and Mal would get to the boat before everyone else, destroying most of the flotation devices minus the boat that he takes, and the raft. This leaves Scott, Zoe, and Duncan with the raft. And since Cameron isn't here anymore, they wouldn't have the idea to throw Scott out to get Fang as a propeller device, so the raft would just be a very slow device, leaving them pretty far behind of everybody else. However, the raft would momentarily catch up with Gwen and Courtney, since their boat motor got blown up and they weren't able to use it for a while, so they had to paddle their own boat instead. And because they're paddling their boat and they're paddling their boat, you know, they travel about the same speed, so they're just right next to each other. And Duncan would take this time while being closer to them to try and really convince Courtney and Gwen about Mal, since he mentioned it to them earlier, but they both just laughed at him. So we would really want to try and instill with them that Mal's a bad person and he shouldn't trust them. And they would still mostly kind of laugh it off since they're both against Duncan. But now that Zoe's here and Gwen and Zoe have a somewhat good connection, Gwen would take Zoe's word a little bit more seriously about Mal, and she would decide to look out for Mal a little bit. From here, just about everything else in the challenge plays the same. Courtney and Gwen's motor would eventually get fixed, leaving the raft behind. The raft would pass the spa hotel. The raft would pass Playa de Losers, and Duncan would go off to go blow it up. Zoe would still put herself in danger to get Mike out, and then Mal would help Zoe to make it appear like Mike's still in control of Zoe. Alejandro and Heather's boat would run out of gas just before the finish line, and this time Heather would push Alejandro out of the boat and run to the front of the boat to cross the finish line, winning immunity. Heather would also be able to choose one person to go to the spa hotel since she won the challenge, and it's weird because in the original Chris offers the winner the choice to take someone to the spa hotel before someone is eliminated. If she chose someone, like just to say she chose Mike and then Mike got eliminated, Mike obviously couldn't go to the spa hotel. So it's weird that Chris does that, and I'm just going to say that Chris doesn't ask the winner to take someone to the spa hotel until after the vote, because that makes much more sense. Also because I do feel like Heather would have taken Duncan, considering he's the only person who's not in any strong alliance. Yeah, we're just going to wait till after the vote, and then she'll pick someone to go to the spa hotel. And that was a bit of a spoiler, but obviously Duncan would still be removed from the game for blowing up the mansion. And the vote would still happen, not mattering at all. And Mal had originally rigged the votes against Cameron, but the thing is, Mal is such a terribly written villain that this is never explained about why he did this, and it really doesn't make any sense at all, because in Mal's eyes, Cameron was his ally, so getting rid of him didn't help him at all. But after a lot of thought, I figured the only logical reason that Mal would want Cameron out is because Cameron is trying to help Mike figure out how to deal with Mal, and Mal tried to frame Alejandro the next episode with, the votes about Cameron. So I'm assuming Mal would still rig the votes, so that planning that he could still frame somebody with all the votes like he tried to with Alejandro. And out of the options of who Mal would want to frame the votes, since he does still think this is a real vote and he would frame the votes against somebody to actually get rid of them, I believe he'd choose Courtney, since she has the most pull in the game right now. Wouldn't make sense for him to get rid of Zoe. Gwen and Scott are kind of non-factors, and Heather and Alejandro are both the type of people that Mal would probably plan on, framing for doing the votes. So Courtney made the most sense in my mind, but obviously Chris still says the same thing of Duncan got eliminated, so Courtney gets to stay. And then Courtney, Gwen, and Scott would all be suspicious, since Chris says it's a unanimous vote, and obviously these three know they didn't vote for Courtney. And now, Chris would ask Heather who she wants to take to the spa hotel. And to just quickly go through the options, she wouldn't want to take Alejandro because she's still kind of mad at him for what he did. And even though they are in an alliance, it would make more sense for her to take somebody else to try and get them in their alliance. And she wouldn't really want to take Courtney or Gwen since neither of them like her. And Scott is way too loyal to Courtney, and Heather would know that, so there's not much point in taking Scott. And then Mike is just someone she genuinely doesn't really see anything in, and she wouldn't have a reason to take him. But I think Zoe actually works pretty well. Since Heather saw Zoe last season, and she saw Zoe as a very nice and agreeable person, and Heather could probably figure that she could manipulate Zoe pretty easily with that. So she would take Zoe to the spa hotel with her. Zoe and Heather would be at the spa hotel together, with Heather trying to make an alliance with Zoe. But Zoe is very reluctant since she knows what Heather is like, and she even tells Heather, I'm not the same gullible, blindly nice girl I was last season. It's not going to work, so you can just give it up. But in World Tour, it was shown that Heather was/is kind of a crafty girly girl with her liking glitter glue. And I think it'd be kind of cute if Zoe and Heather could bond over, arts and crafts, and Zoe being excited to find someone else like that, while Heather's really embarrassed about it. But Heather would take that shared interest of Zoe to try and create a bond, and it does work pretty well with them getting along. Mal would still be in the loser's cabin, trying to frame somebody with the votes, and obviously he couldn't frame Alejandro, since Alejandro is in his cabin. So he couldn't sneak the votes under Alejandro's bed because Alejandro is there. So the only other person that he could frame for Courtney votes is Heather. So he would start a search party with Courtney, Gwen, and Scott, saying that we should look around for clues to see who did it to Courtney. And because Heather is busy recruiting Zoe in the spa hotel, Heather wouldn't have time to explore the spa hotel and potentially find the camera room that Alejandro originally finds to reveal Mal. So Heather wouldn't find that. That means Mal's plan would actually work, and they would find all the votes underneath Heather's bed, and all of them believe it's a thing that Heather would do. So they are all against Heather now. But Gwen would confess in a confessional that she isn't completely sure because of what Duncan and Zoe said to her about Mal last episode. She wouldn't really trust Mike fully. Courtney and Scott would still accidentally kiss, falling on top of each other, making them a couple. And Chris would still get kidnapped by feral Zeke, making the challenge to save Chris. And because Courtney is still here, she's able to raise the stakes for the winner of the challenge, getting permanent residence at the spa hotel. And when it comes to people grouping off for the challenge, Courtney and Scott still go together, Mike and Zoe would go off together, and Heather still trying to gain Zoe's trust goes off with them, and Gwen not having anyone else to go with because Alejandro denies her, Gwen would also come. Just like the original, Alejandro goes off of himself, because even though he does have a temporary alliance with Heather, and he saw what Heather did to him last challenge, throwing him under the bus so that she could get the win, and he would want to make sure he can win this challenge so he can get permanent spa hotel residence, which would give him the best chance of winning future challenges. When these four are off together, the floor under Gwen's feet breaks, causing her to go into the mines, and there's no reason for that not to happen. So that would still happen, and just like the original, Zoe would follow after Gwen. And Mal would pull Heather down a separate hole, telling her he has a good feeling about it, since he'd want to split up the group. Still like the original, Zoe would comfort Gwen down in the hole for claustrophobia, helping her calm down, making their bond stronger. And Mal not being with Cameron this time, would now instead try to convince Heather to kiss Scott to break up Courtney and Scott, saying it would be easy to convince Courtney that Scott cheated on her since she was already cheated on Duncan in World Tour. Heather is disgusted by the idea of kissing Scott and profusely rejects the idea while agreeing that they should still find a way to break them up. Zoe would get kidnapped by Zeke first, scaring Gwen and making her alone. Scott and Courtney would fall into Mal and Heather, and Mal seeing the opportunity pushes Heather into Scott, causing them to kiss, and Heather, after she's done being grossed out from the kiss, realizes that she can't back out of the plan, otherwise it will paint her in a bad light. So she accuses Scott of kissing her, making Courtney freak out at Scott. While Courtney and Scott are fighting, Mal takes the chance to sneak away, with Heather following, causing Courtney and Scott to be caught by Zeke. Heather would fall into the hole that Cameron fell into originally, and Mal would walk away, leaving her hanging on the edge. Alejandro comes up afterwards and finds Heather, offering to pull her up if she promises to vote with him this round. And Heather is fine with this since she is angry at Mike for pushing her into Scott and then leaving her to hang. But originally Zeke immediately caught Alejandro after his talk with Cameron at the hole, so presumably he would still be there, and this time he would catch Alejandro and Heather. This leaves only Mal and Gwen to win the challenge. And this concept wasn't seen till the next episode, but Mal still would have caught all of Mike's other alternate personalities, be able to use them, and being annoyed at how long it's taking for him to find Chris, he would bring out Manitoba to explore the mines more effectively. Gwen was originally seen trying to escape the cave, but Chef passed by her originally, and Gwen seeing Chef would go to follow after him, since she really didn't like being alone in the cave. Chef would go into the main cave with Chris, but Zeke would get a hold of the pasta shooter that Chef brought and use it against Chef just like the original. Gwen, following after Chef, would hide behind the phone waiting for a good moment to save Chris. Mal at this point would be in the room and switch to the personality of Svetlana to sneak past Zeke and jump through the air to save Chris from the vat of toxic waste. Zeke would get angry at Mal saving Chris and go to fight him, but at this point Gwen has now had enough time to make it to Chef's pasta launcher and shoot Zeke. And since both Mike and Gwen contributed to saving Chris would give them both immunity and decide that they can both have permanent residence in the spa hotel for the rest of the time they are in the game. When it comes to the vote, it's pretty clear that Heather goes home. I think everyone except Alejandro is against her after Mal's plan to frame her for sabotaging the votes. But Zoe would trust Mike a lot more than she trusts Heather. Even with getting fishy vibes from Mike, she still trusts the person she's known for a season, who's been nice. If Mike told her that Heather did sabotage the votes, then Zoe with a heavy heart would probably agree that that happened. It's also very possible that Courtney votes for Scott over Heather because she is so heartbroken by Scott cheating on her. And it's also very possible that Alejandro and Heather could work together in that vote against Scott. But in my opinion, the other four are still too much against Heather for them to change their vote. It means Heather gets eliminated. Gwen being in the spa hotel would see all the paintings of Chris in her room, since they were relocated there after his mansion blew up. She would want to leave that room because it's creepy, and while exploring the spa hotel, she would stumble into the surveillance room that has the cameras, and find the DVD of Mal's greatest hits. And since in this timeline she was more properly warned on Mike Mal from Duncan, she would play the DVD and see Mal sabotaging people. Courtney and Zoe would be in the losers' girls' cabins, while Zoe is comforting Courtney, who still feels heartbroken by Scott. And Alejandro and Scott would be in the boys' cabin, while Scott is complaining about them breaking up since Scott didn't kiss Courtney, she kissed him. And Alejandro wouldn't really care, but trying to make allies with Scott would tell him that he should just go and try to clear things up with Courtney. Scott takes his advice and goes to confront Courtney, but Courtney instantly freaks out at the sight of him and yells at him as sounds of crashing can be heard. Alejandro just shrugs while Zoe has to pull Courtney off of him. Luckily, everyone was in this challenge originally, so we have a pretty good idea of how everybody would do in the challenge, but obviously some things would change. Mal was originally pushing for everyone to vote for Alejandro, saying that Al let Cameron hang instead of helping him, but now that Heather was hanging and Alejandro helped her, Mal wouldn't have anything against Alejandro. Still, he would go around just telling people that they should still get rid of him because he's a threat, which, still makes sense because he is a pretty big threat. At the beginning of the challenge, Mal would talk with Zoe to get her to help him vote out Alejandro, and with this knowledge, Zoe goes directly to Gwen and tells her about their plan to vote out Alejandro. But now since Gwen has found a DVD of Mal, she would tell Zoe that she needs to trust her, and that Mal has taken over and Mike isn't in there anymore, and they need to vote him out. This stuns Zoe as she just walks away from Gwen, telling her that she needs some time to process this. Gwen would now take over the role of Alejandro in this episode, trying to recruit people against Mal, except she will be a lot more successful since Mal is currently targeting Alejandro, so Mal doesn't know she knows anything. And originally in the episode, anytime Alejandro was about to tell somebody about Mal hurt Alejandro, that way he wouldn't be able to tell anybody. But since Mal doesn't know that Gwen knows, he wouldn't be there to stop her anytime she's about to reveal Mal to somebody. Everything with Mal and Alejandro would still happen at the snapping bars, because Alejandro would be upset at Mal for getting Heather eliminated since he wanted to exact revenge on her. This causes Mal to use Svetlana, Mike frees Svetlana, and Mal falls in the turtle water, and Alejandro gets the lead. And originally, Alejandro actually rates once he gets the lead because he wants to talk to Zoe and convince her to vote for Mike. But since Alejandro doesn't know about Mal, and would view trying to convince Zoe to vote out Mike is impossible because, he's seen how close they are together, so he would just extend his lead by continuing the challenge. Mike would take his time in the back to convince Courtney and Scott to vote for Alejandro, but at this point, Gwen has already talked to both Scott and Courtney, and I imagine with the big lead that Alejandro had already in the original, and now that he wouldn't have wasted time waiting for Zoe, I think he easily wins immunity, just getting to the end way before anybody else could get to him. When it comes to the vote, Gwen and Courtney vote for Mike, but I had to mainly account for what Zoe was going to do. And considering in the final four, when Zoe knew that Mal was in control, she still took him to the finale in hopes that Mike would regain control. I think that same logic in her head would still apply here. So Zoe trying to save Mal would tell him that Gwen was targeting him and that they need to get the numbers in their favor or else he'll be eliminated. Mal gets angry finding out that Gwen was targeting him, Having come up with a plan quickly, he realizes that he and Zoe need to get Alejandro and Scott to vote with them, because there's no way he could get Courtney to vote against Gwen. So Mal would go off with Scott and manipulate him into believing that Gwen set Heather up last episode to kiss Scott, because Gwen was jealous of Scott taking Courtney away from her. And Scott, being dumb and still emotional about losing Courtney, thinks that what Mike says makes sense and agrees to vote off Gwen. And Zoe would go off with Alejandro, and using her short-lived connection with Heather, says she would like to work with Alejandro and wants him to vote off Gwen. It's hard to tell if this would fully work since Alejandro isn't a big fan of Mike, but Alejandro could be desperate to be a part of Alliance since, he really has nobody right now, so he would take this opportunity. And even in the chance that Alejandro doesn't follow through with this and he votes with Gwen and Courtney, it becomes a free tie between Gwen and Mike. And I do think Mal could probably beat Gwen in most things, especially since this was an obstacle course episode and, Mal was able to reach Svetlana, Vito for strength challenges. Like, Mal could probably beat Zoe in a tiebreaker. So even if Alejandro doesn't go along, Gwen would still get eliminated this episode. Gwen would be heartbroken from the vote since she thought she could trust Zoe, and Zoe looks very guilty about it as Courtney gives Gwen a hug before she is eliminated. And considering that Zoe made an offer of an alliance to Alejandro would take Zoe to the spa hotel as his +1, and Mal would still get to go there because he saved Chris from the last episode, meaning these three go to the spa hotel. This episode starts off with Mal, who is still pretending to be Mike, thanking Zoe for saving him last night, in which Zoe tells him to drop the act and that she knows Mal is in control. This warns Mal to drop the Mike act and asks Zoe why she would save him if she knew he wasn't Mike. And Zoe tells him that she did it for Mike, not him, because she knows that the good guy she likes is still in there. Mal laughs at her, telling her that Mike is gone for good, and that it's ironic that she wants a good guy to come out, considering what she did last night to her friend, Gwen. Zoe struggles hearing this, wondering if she was being a bad person by voting out Gwen, but tries to reassure herself, saying that she only did it to save Mike. Alejandro would see Mike and Zoe talking, but quickly dismiss it since it doesn't matter to him. The only thing Alejandro wants to do is get Mike out, as vengeance for removing Heather before Alejandro could get his revenge on her, which is somewhat excuse, somewhat Alejandro not wanting to say he likes Heather since, that's the whole thing. They both act like they don't like each other, but they do. Courtney and Scott would be the only ones in the losers cabin, both respective boys and girls side, but not having anybody else to distract them, they would both struggle with missing each other. And Courtney would eventually come over to confront Scott about voting for Gwen, and Scott would tell her what Mal told him about, Gwen being the one who set Heather up to kiss him. And Courtney is very skeptical about this since she didn't think Gwen was a bad friend like that, but because she doesn't think that Scott would cheat on her, she believes him, she would forgive him, and ask if he would still consider going out with her, which he accepts. Courtney would still make a list like the original of who's going to get eliminated, but because originally that list was showing her getting rid of Gwen before the finale even though they made an agreement, it actually shows her taking Scott to the end. I don't think Mal could exactly perceive Scott being so upset about being drawn as a rat that he would have enough reason to show the list. Also, originally he did it when it was a 3-2 of them, so, they were clearly outnumbered, but now that Alejandro is in the mix again, they all have a target with Alejandro because he's the biggest threat in the game. So Mal wouldn't have a reason to show the chart to anyone. When it comes to the challenge, I think Alejandro would take the early lead, but this time focus more on trying to get people to vote for Mike, like he originally does in this episode. And this time Mal wouldn't be as focused on winning like he was in the original, because he originally wanted to do that to make sure he could get to the spa hotel so he could find the DVD and destroy it before anybody else finds it. But now that Zoe knows that, it isn't that big a deal. Still, Alejandro and Mal would mostly hold the lead as Mal is interfering with Alejandro, since he's Mal's next target. When Alejandro goes to recruit Scott against Mike, Scott doesn't really want to work with Alejandro since he's shifty, and Zoe, still being a protector of Mike/Mal, would remind Scott of what Mike told him last episode about, Gwen being the bad person and him warning Scott. So Scott would feel a bit indebted to Mike, at least for this round, because of him warning him about Gwen. And when Alejandro goes to recruit Courtney, Courtney is already obviously still hesitant since they aren't in the best terms. But again, once Alejandro leaves, Zoe comes up behind and talks to Courtney, and hearing her concern tells her that Alejandro is probably somehow involved because, well, he's Alejandro, probably the greatest manipulator in the game, so Courtney agrees with that, and also doesn't want to vote with Alejandro. Alejandro is starting to get the vibe that no one's biting on his plan to vote out Mike, so he instead focuses heavily on winning immunity. But since Mal is still here and mostly in the lead, he would sabotage the fire-breathing flower, destroying the chocolate sauce for Courtney and Scott. Or in the back. This means that Courtney would still put her burnt flakes on her ice cream, making it basically inedible after a bird pukes on it and becomes really gross. And then Courtney would still pass the finish line. First with her shortcut, but just like the original, Chris would change it into an eating challenge after that. And the only person who wasn't here originally was Alejandro. And given in World Tour, it was shown that he doesn't have a strong stomach and doesn't like eating any sweets to contaminate his body. And even though eating ice cream obviously isn't the same as, eating gross foods and Chinese fake out, he still doesn't really like eating sweet stuff and he wouldn't be able to do it very quickly. Meaning that just like the original, Zoe would win immunity. Zoe would talk to Mal before the vote, and she would tell Mal about Alejandro targeting him and that she was able to make Scott and Courtney lean towards Alejandro, so it's okay. Mal would be impressed with Zoe and tease her for acting villainous, which makes Zoe uncomfortable as she doesn't know if he's right. And the votes come out as you expect they would. Alejandro is a massive threat, and even though Courtney and Scott have a vibe from Mike that he isn't a great guy, neither of them have strong enough evidence to believe he's incredibly dangerous as he is. So Alejandro remains the biggest threat, and they vote him out in a 4-1 vote, with Alejandro being upset that Mike was able to outsmart him. This episode would start off with Mike, Scott, and Courtney in the loser's cabin, while Zoe is in the spa hotel still trying to process if she's a bad person for helping Mal. Courtney being alone in the girls' side of the cabin would have time to think, and she's still very confused by the whole Heather and Scott kissing/Gwen situation, because she really doesn't believe that Gwen would do that to her. So to get closure on this, Courtney would sneak into the spa hotel, into the camera room that she knows about from the Zeke episode, and rewatches the Heather and Scott kiss in the mines to know what really happened. And she clearly sees Mike push Heather into Scott, which stuns her, as she also watches the aftermath of Mike convincing Scott that Gwen set Heather up. This also causes her to look further into Mike, eventually finding out about Mal. Courtney would reveal Mal at the beginning of the next challenge, causing him to drop the act around everybody, confusing Scott and making Zoe have to feign being surprised. Courtney sees through Zoe and judges her for realizing she knew about Mal the entire time. Mal starts talking back to Courtney, even grabbing Zoe under his arm, telling Courtney that he's going to destroy her. When it comes to the challenge, originally Zoe was allowed to pick first because she won the last challenge, and she still did win the last challenge, so she would get the first pick, which would still be the Yeti. And because Gwen was next originally, I had Courtney go next, and it's a bit assumptionist to say that Courtney would get the painting box since she could have chosen any box. So I decided to spin a random wheel to select the object that she had to retrieve, and she got the Chris painting, so yeah, guess it worked out. And because Courtney got the painting selection, Scott and Mal would still get the same items because there isn't reason they would choose a different box. Mal would see his item being the long-lost Chris statue, and like the original, just plan to sabotage others as he doesn't know where to find it. Most of the beginning part of the challenge remained the same. Mal would still follow, this time Courtney, to Chris's destroyed mansion, and unlike the original, he can't just walk up behind her and make small talk, but he would just wait in the shadows and tip over the supporting beam structure when he has the chance, drowning Courtney in ruins as he leaves to sabotage Scott. Mal wouldn't be able to pretend work with Scott because Scott knows he is Mal and wouldn't trust him after all the lying he's done. However, Mal could still find a way to sabotage Scott's attempt at getting the diamond from Fang, and especially since Scott wasn't having much luck before Mal came, it wouldn't be that hard. Courtney, being the overachiever that she is, would act very similar to Gwen, trying to repaint the painting with exotic materials. I'm talking about bear shit. There is very little reason for me to believe that Scott could get the diamond or avoid getting hurt, which would result in Mal still taking an injured Scott to Chris instead. But Zoe would still come back first with the Yeti, and then Mal and Scott would come shortly after, with Mal telling Chris that it's an injured competitor, keeping him kind of safe since Scott brought back nothing. But Courtney would come back with the redone painting, and like the original, Chris would eliminate her for defacing his painting. And even though Zoe is kind of ashamed of working with Mal this entire time, she truly does believe that Mike is still in there. And considering the alternate option is Scott, someone she very much doesn't like because of last season, safe to say she would take Mal to the end again, but this time it would be a much more shameful act by Zoe since she kinda knows she's wishing on fake stars. For those of you who don't know, with the finales and total drama, there's always alternate winners, and at this point my what-ifs kinda become more of a rewrite as I'm writing the finale. So if you're curious just on a what-if basis, this is the what-if, this is the elimination order, and the alternate winners are Zoe and Mike. But if you want to hear me basically rewrite the finale with this new scenario, then, stay for the ride. Zoe would be in the spa hotel rewatching all of Mal's Greatest Hits DVD, still upset about what she's doing, but remembers that Mike used to break out of his other personalities whenever Zoe was in danger. But she does remember many points in the season where Mal stayed in control despite her being in danger, so she rules it out as being that simple to get Mike out. So instead, Zoe decides she needs to appear emotionally destroyed to get Mike to fight back against Mal. Therefore, Zoe brings the return of Commando Zoe. She taunts Mal before the challenge, acting ruthless like Commando Zoe does, and Mal isn't threatened but is impressed and even taking a bit of a liking to Zoe, since at first he thought that she was a pushover nice girl but likes to see some edge to her. They would walk together to the final challenge, and Commando Zoe would continue acting mean towards Mal, making him happy, but Mike takes slight control, being able to see with Mal's vision, and is sad that Commando Zoe is back, since he knows last season Commando Zoe came out when Zoe was in a really emotionally destroyed place. So Mike would feel bad and more determined to get her out. Also, I haven't mentioned it, but everything that's been happening in Mike's mind with Mike traveling to the tower with all his other personalities has still been happening, so he'd still be there. Commando Zoe and Mal would still shoot down their helpers, and again, reminder at this point in the finales, the what if changes from essentially to a rewrite, meaning I can choose whoever I want from the helpers, and I decided that Commando Zoe shot down Gwen and Heather, and Mal shot down Alejandro and Duncan. Heather and Gwen are surprised by Zoe's transformation, since neither of them have seen this version of Zoe. They are a bit confused but still support her, since they both like her. And Duncan is extremely reluctant to help Mal because of obvious reasons, but Mal points out to Duncan that helping someone as cool as Mal would be a pretty bad boy thing to do, making Duncan want to help him. I know in the original Heather and Alejandro made up and they were all lovey-dovey, but that idea sparked from them both being flushed to the Yukon after their eliminations. But neither of them were sent to the Yukon now because they were eliminated at different points. Also, neither of them truly got revenge on each other, so they'd still have a lot of tension there. This means that both Heather and Alejandro are acting super competitive, planning to help their respective finalists win, so Heather and Alejandro can beat each other. In essence. Commando Zoe would instantly have the plan to pole vault with the sticks since she's naturally very agile, and once she gets to the other side, she plays with the idea of leaving her helpers behind, but showing she still has a heart, she makes away from them by lining up the ladder as a bridge so they can walk across. Mal would do the same thing as the original, he'd pole vault over the toxic waste, and he would opt to leave his helpers behind as it would slow him down. This would make Duncan and Alejandro annoyed as they have to take a log ride across the toxic waste to get to the other side. Mal would also go over to sabotage Zoe by pushing her helpers off the ledge, and once he pushes Gwen over, that would be the final straw for Duncan, as he goes over to throw a punch at Mal, not wanting to help him anymore. But Mal would anticipate this and grab Duncan's wrist, churning it and throwing him over the edge, spraining Duncan's ankle as he falls. Even though Duncan failed miserably at stopping Mal, Gwen would talk to him after he's thrown down and ask why he did that, and Duncan tells her that he realizes there's bad and then there's rotten, and Gwen would appreciate the gesture of Duncan churning on Mal. Mal would pogo stick and would tackle Zoe into the water on the third level, and like the original, Mike would take back control at this point. Mike and Mal would be in Mike's brain where Mal's tower is destroyed. Mike tells Mal that he knows why Mal exists in his mind. He existed for a time where Mike struggled with people bullying him for his condition and wanted to have any sort of control of his life, so Mal was created to give him the power he wanted during those times. But Mike also tells Mal that he doesn't need him anymore, and he found his own power, and it isn't from being evil or cruel to others, but it's within the strength his friends give him and himself. Mal pleads with Mike, telling him that he's making a mistake and that he's part of Mike. Mike tells him that he's a part of him he doesn't need anymore and walks away from him as Mal's body fades from Mike's mind. Mike returns to the present, hearing the yells of Zoe being attacked by Fang. Mike saves Commando Zoe from Fang, telling her it's truly him now. Zoe doesn't know whether to believe him, but after he asks about the necklace, Zoe wipes off her face paint as Commando Zoe and kisses him on the cheek. They both refocus as they continue in the challenge, with giving them alternate winning endings based on who retrieving the sword. In Zoe's winning ending, Mike congratulates Zoe on winning, as Gwen runs up to Zoe giving her a hug for winning, saying she's proud of her, and Heather rubs it in Alejandro's face that her finalist won while complimenting Zoe. In Mike's winning ending, Zoe tackles him down to the ground for a hug while congratulating him, and Mike is proud of himself being able to overcome Mal. Duncan thanks Mike for finally getting rid of Mal, while Alejandro compliments Mike's abilities to rub it into Heather's face that his finalist won over hers. And there we go. That's what if Heather held onto her invincibility statue. I'll be completely candid in saying that this is probably my least favorite what if I've done for my channel. I feel with All Stars it's really hard to create a story that is substantial, especially jumping in halfway. Because even with Pakatu Island, which was a train wreck of a season, maybe even more All-Stars debatably, that season is that the characters either weren't developed or they were developed in a bad way, so I was able to change that. But with All-Stars, you just jump straight into it and it's instantly like, Duncan is a loser now who wants to be cool, Alejandro's doing a stupid thing, Zoe's become 20 times dumber, and Mal is just the simply worst written villain, just an 80s cartoon villain twirling his mustache, and it was really annoying to write it because there are elements of the story I had to continue moving even though I didn't want to. So as a what if scenario, I kind of just have to let it happen as I sit back, and it's really annoying, honestly. So I don't know if this is going to be a good video. I devoted so much time to it and I've already basically done, so I decided I might as well upload it. If you hate it, then, I'm sorry. But if you have stayed here for this long, I figured that I might as well give you some sort of nice little treat before you go. A lot of people ask me about what ifs I plan on doing in the future and which ones I'm currently going to do. I do know what I'm going to do next. I've said it a lot that I want to try and get one for every season before I start going all around. So, as you've already probably recollected if you've seen my other videos, is that my next video will be on Island, and it will be what if Ezekiel kept his mouth shut at the first elimination ceremony. I've seen that one thrown around my comment section a lot, so I figured it's going to be interesting, and I figured it's also going to take a while, so I wanted to try and get this one out for or while I was working on that one. Anyways, bye. See ya. Bye bye.